For the past 75 years, NATO has been protecting Europe, and the United States has been the backbone of NATO. However, everything is about to change with the arrival of Donald Trump. Trump has openly stated that the US should leave NATO because it is no longer needed. The heated debate between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky has left all European leaders sleepless. Germany's new chancellor has also stated that they want independence from the US, and NATO will soon dissolve. The million-dollar question is whether Europe can defend itself against Russia if the US leaves NATO. In a press conference, when Trump asked the UK Prime Minister if the UK could fight Russia without the US, the only response was laughter.
Could you take on Russia by yourselves?
Well,
The most important question is, what impact would the US leaving NATO have on America itself? For decades, the US has conducted operations in other countries with NATO, whether in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Libya. If the US leaves NATO, can it still be powerful enough to fight alone? Another important question is whether China would not take advantage of this situation. The US strategy to control the Arctic also depends on NATO. If NATO collapses, what will happen to this strategy? Today, we are going to discuss the downfall of the world's largest military alliance, which could change the entire world order and possibly return the world to a stage similar to that after World War II. First, let's understand how NATO was formed and why it became so dependent on the US. After World War II, Europe was weak, and the Soviet Union was rapidly advancing towards Europe. To stop the Soviet Union, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed on April 4, 1949. The organization's sole goal was that if any member country was attacked, all would defend it together. The US led the organization, providing military leadership, nuclear protection, and financial support. During the Cold War, NATO became even more important, and the US established permanent military bases in West Germany, Italy, and the UK to protect against the Soviet Union. Over time, many European countries reduced their military spending and began to rely on US protection. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, many thought NATO might no longer be needed. However, NATO expanded instead. Many Eastern European countries, previously under Soviet control, wanted to join NATO, fearing Russian reoccupation. By 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and other countries became NATO members, bringing NATO to Russia's borders. Russia saw this as a direct threat and accused the West of breaking promises not to expand NATO after the Cold War. Despite these accusations, NATO promised Ukraine and Georgia future membership in 2008. Russia responded by attacking Georgia that year, signaling it would not tolerate further NATO expansion. In 2014, Russia seized Crimea, prompting NATO to deploy more troops and missile systems in Eastern Europe, with the US providing the majority of military funding and arms. Under Barack Obama, the US tried to expand NATO without provoking Russia, increasing NATO's army in Eastern Europe, but assuring Russia that Ukraine would not be included. However, after Joe Biden became president, the US openly supported Ukraine, sending billions in military aid. During this time, Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership in 2022. Russia, enraged by NATO's expansion, launched a full-scale attack on Ukraine in February 2022. This war transformed NATO's role as it began directly supplying weapons and funds to Ukraine. NATO, despite being powerful, remains heavily dependent on US leadership, military funding, and strength. In 2023, the US contributed about 70% of NATO's total defense budget, making it the largest financial supporter of the alliance. Many European countries, such as Germany and France, had reduced their military budgets after the Cold War, relying on US protection. The US not only funds NATO, but also maintains a significant military presence in Europe, with about 100,000 troops stationed in NATO countries and permanent bases in Germany, Italy, Poland, and the UK. The US supplies NATO countries with state-of-the-art weapons, including advanced missile defense systems like Patriot and Aegis Ashore, which protect European countries from potential missile attacks. The US also provides military jets like the F-35, F-16, and F-15. In terms of nuclear support, some experts believe the US has about 100 nuclear bombs stored in NATO countries such as Germany, Belgium, Italy, and the Netherlands. The US also assists NATO armies by tracking enemy movements and intercepting communications using spy satellites and drones. However, after Donald Trump became president, significant changes were anticipated. Trump has criticized NATO, accusing European countries of not contributing enough. He recently stated that if NATO countries do not increase their military spending, the US might not defend them and could even leave NATO. If the US leaves NATO, the alliance would lose 70% of its defense funding and access to US nuclear bombs, highly trained troops, and advanced weapons. If we consider European defense spending without US contributions, in 2024, Europe's total defense spending was about $457 billion, while Russia's defense budget, adjusted for purchasing power parity, was approximately $461.6 billion. This marks the first time Russia has spent more on its military than Europe. Moreover, Asian armies operate under a single command and language, whereas European armies are divided among many commanders and languages. To replace the US military presence, Europe would need to significantly increase its military power, potentially adding around 50 brigades with thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery. Although Europe has about 45 million troops on paper, they are divided among 28 countries with separate leadership and command structures. Unlike the US Army, which operates under a single command, European armies operate under their respective national military generals, lacking a unified strategy or plan. Let's discuss how the US leaving NATO would affect America itself. For 76 years, the US has used NATO as a tool to project its military power globally. Whether in the Afghan War, Iraq War, or Libyan War, NATO forces have always supported the US. If the US leaves NATO, it would not have European support in future conflicts, which has been significant. For instance, in the Afghan War, the UK, Germany, and France provided thousands of troops and weapons. Another significant advantage of NATO is the network of military bases and supply routes across Europe and the Middle East. If the US leaves NATO, it would lose access to these bases and need to negotiate separate agreements with each country, which would be time-consuming and require political bargaining. Wars are not won solely by military strength, but by strategy, international support, and coordinated efforts. Without NATO, the US would remain powerful, but would have to bear the entire burden of global conflicts alone. The US Arctic strategy also comes into play. If NATO weakens or dissolves during Trump's presidency, the Arctic will become a critical battlefront for the US. The Arctic is rapidly becoming an important region due to its oil, gas, and rare earth minerals. As the ice melts, new trade routes will emerge, and whoever controls the Arctic will also control future trade, military strategy, and resources. Currently, NATO provides the US with a strong alliance in the Arctic, particularly through Canada, Norway, Greenland, and Iceland. However, if NATO collapses, the US would need to rethink its entire Arctic strategy because it would no longer have the support of these countries. Russia has the most military presence in the Arctic, with over 50 military bases and the world's largest fleet of icebreakers. The US has only 2 icebreaker ships and a few military bases, mostly in Alaska. To maintain its presence in the Arctic, the US would need to invest heavily in new icebreakers and increase its naval presence to counter Russia and China. If NATO dissolves, another disadvantage for the US would be that Europe might seek security from another superpower. This is where China comes into the picture. If the US leaves NATO, China could offer security to European countries and build strong economic and military relations with them. Historically, Europe has aligned with the West, but China has invested billions in Europe, particularly in infrastructure and technology through its Belt and Road Initiative. China has significant investments in countries like Italy, Greece, and Hungary, including a majority stake in Greece's Piraeus port, one of Europe's busiest ports. China's growing investment in Germany's car industry and startups is also concerning for many analysts, as they believe Europe is becoming dependent on Beijing's investments. If NATO weakens, China could use its economic power to exert political pressure on European countries and force them into closer cooperation. China already has a strong alliance with Russia, and if the US withdraws from NATO, Moscow and Beijing might become even closer, potentially leading to a new world order where China and Russia dominate. If NATO collapses, the US would face compromised security, leading to an Arctic Cold War where the US, Russia and China would compete for control of Arctic waters, resources and military territories. If the US does not act quickly, Russia and China could establish dominance in the region, controlling trade routes and resources. Subscribe my channel and you might also like this video about Elon Musk, a genius or psycho.